In Chapter 4, we are going to be exploring concepts related to cultural context and the idea of career. Particularly in more Western culture, career is very much tied to identity. But as we're talking about this sense of identity, we need to consider all the other sources of identity that are interacting with and potentially conflicting with that aspect of career. So we can't talk about career without talking about other aspects of cultural identity. So career is deeply connected to this idea of culture. And in working with individuals and talking about career in a counseling context, we need to have awareness of the different aspects of culture that make up an individual's identity. So we're going to briefly talk about some of those concepts and then how they impact career for individuals, and then also trends related to how they can impact and represent potential barriers to career success. So identity is made up of a lot of different aspects of a person's being. And generally, a great way to move into a counseling space is to just carry an underlying assumption that each person has their own unique sense of identity. So even if they have some characteristics or labels that align with or are different from your own, we can't make any assumptions about someone based on one label alone. So there are lots of things that come together to create each individual sense of cultural identity, and those really need to be honored in the counseling space, no matter what we're talking about. So I think we generally go to areas of things like race, ethnicity, and gender when we're talking about culture, but there's so much more than that. There is a sense of age and lifespan. So especially related to career, age plays a lot into the picture of how you conceptualize yourself in career. Thinking a lot about individuals who maybe are in middle age or going into late adulthood and perhaps are forced to make a career change without choosing it. Age is a huge part of that picture. Socioeconomic and status and class obviously also play into the idea of career quite a bit because compensation and salary are a big part of the career picture. And those things shape your resources, your socioeconomic status, your access to things like health insurance, affordable housing, ability to care for your family. There's a lot of things connected there. Religion is a huge part of cultural identity in general, and again, can play very much into the career picture. Thinking about, does my career give me opportunities to take time off to honor my religious holidays? Does it give me opportunities to express and acknowledge my religion publicly without being negatively impacted in my workplace? Obviously, sexual orientation has a huge aspect of identity in general. But again, thinking about, is it safe to bring my significant other to a company function? And will they be accepted? And is it safe to be open about who I am in a workplace without facing discrimination? Language, obviously, if English is a second language, can create a lot of barriers to being successful in certain career fields. And then we'll talk about ability levels. So mental illness, mental disability, physical ability level can create opportunities or limitations in different career fields based on these. So when we put all of these things together, that creates a unique sense of identity for each individual person that we need to consider as we're talking about career, which is why we keep harping on the idea that it's not about matching someone to a career field, it's about exploring and finding how career connects to pieces of their own identity. So this may or may not be the first time you've seen this diagram. These are the multicultural and social justice counseling competencies. They have been endorsed by the American Counseling Association and represent standards of practice for cultural awareness. And the key elements here are the idea that in order to work from a culturally aware space, we have to be aware of both our own lens and positionality in the world and that of our client. And so we have to consider the types of privileges that we have and the type of privileges that our client might have. And then similarly, any sense of marginalization that we as the counselor have and our client might have. as that plays into the dynamic in the counseling space. So we've talked about the idea that identity is unique to each individual. Now we're talking about how the dynamic can change in the counseling space based on those identities. So there are considerations for if the counselor is in a space that's more privileged and the client is in a space that's more marginalized, or on the reverse side of things. So if the client is more privileged and the counselor is more marginalized, and that might seem surprising, but it happens more than you might think. So imagining yourself as a brand new counseling graduate, provisionally licensed, maybe up to your eyeballs in student loan debt, and you start working in a private practice with affluent clients who don't have those things to struggle with and don't have to worry about affordable housing and food insecurity. We can't necessarily allow our client to be privy to that information, but it certainly impacts our interactions with others, our thought process, the way we see the world. And so we have to think about how those play into the dynamic of the counseling relationship and take time to understand our worldview, the client's worldview, and how those things might influence our choice when it comes to our approach, our intervention, our work with the clients. And then MSJCC, if you want to learn more, certainly look it up. There's an entire handbook that goes with it, and it is linked in the module. But there's ideas that you can delve deeper into this by exploring how your action skills, knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs all play into this dynamic as well. So let's first talk about gender a little bit. And with the caveat that I pulled these demographics from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, and they tend to work from a very binary perspective when it comes to gender. So most of these are going to be displayed in the idea of male versus female, with not a lot of representation and inclusion of non-binary or transgender or gender expansive individuals. That's not an intentional exclusion, but the US Bureau of Labor Statistics doesn't necessarily include those in a lot of the statistics that they present related to US jobs. So that's definitely an area that where they could improve their statistical process, but I just want to name that. It was not an intentional way to leave individuals out of the picture. It's just the way the US government tends to shape their statistics when it comes to the US economy. So talking about gender here, just noticing, again, these are our US Bureau of Labor Statistics information, and we see trends that a lot of the higher earning career fields tend to be male dominated. Noticing on the left here that with the exception of maybe pharmacists, which is fairly close to a 50-50 split, a lot of these are heavily male dominated fields. And we see this trend that there are less female workers in higher earning positions, particularly in science, technology, engineering, math, STEM related fields. Also, when we look at things like what we call C-suite management or executive level management, we see very little representation of female individuals and certainly not a lot of representation of gender expansive, transgender, or non-binary individuals in these positions. Shifting over to the right, we notice that lower earning fields tend to be more female dominated. So again, with the exception of dishwashers, which are still skewed more male oriented, the majority of these fields are either evenly split and where we see agricultural related positions, and these are more so thinking about harvesting crops and agricultural products, grading and sorting is going through what's been harvested and then determining what's appropriate to sell in a grocery store or wholesale to a restaurant, things like that. So it's not grading like teaching, it's grading like determining like USDA grades of beef or determining if produce is appropriate to sell to individuals for food consumption by people according to FDA standards. So seeing that the majority of these are female dominated, we start to see the picture of what we call gender inequality when it comes to wages. And it's a really complex conversation. It's not as simple as like, oh, well, we just don't pay people the same amount based on their gender, which we do have research happens, but it's also in the fields that individuals tend to go towards. And so when we talked about in the previous chapter, the idea of working with individuals in different stages of the lifespan, that's where this idea that female identifying persons tend to start ruling out options pretty early on or get overt or covert messages that certain fields are not for them, that makes a difference later in life. And this is what that ends up looking like. Male-dominated spaces feel very uninviting for anyone who's not male identifying, and therefore it's harder to be able to reach the rank and salary that others in that field might reach when you don't hold that identity. And so we have a gender equality issue when it comes to the economy in the United States and in career fields, not simply at the I pay this person less than this person to do the same job level, but it goes beyond that. It goes into the way that career fields tend to be distributed and representation in those career fields. And then we'll add another layer into this. So we're just looking at gender here, but let's add the idea of race and ethnicity into this picture as well. So here we see the addition of considerations of race ethnicity. And this data comes from the US Census Bureau, some of the most recent data available. So it's from 2023. And this graph breaks down what we call the wage gap. And so seeing based on different race ethnicity identities, differences in how individuals are compensated for work that they do. And so what you see at the top, that red bit, is how much more a male identifying individual tends to be paid in a position than a female identifying person. And again, the US Census Bureau works from a pretty binary perspective when it comes to gender. So this is not accounting for transgender, gender expansive, or non-binary persons, but they tend to be lower paid than women. So they're at the bottom of the chart here if we were to include them. The US Census Bureau just did not do that. So looking at differences here, you'll see that individuals with darker skin tones tend to be compensated less than individuals who have maybe lighter, more white presenting skin tones. And then when you add the addition of women versus men are compensated more. So it becomes very complex because you see comparing the wage gap for individuals who have Black identity to white non-Hispanic identities, we see that women in that position would be paid a bit more than a male identifying person with Black identity, but they still are making less than white non-Hispanic males. We see this really interesting trend where individuals of Asian descent are being compensated more. That's not to say that that's not fair either. We're just looking at the disparity here. And ideally, we'd work towards the idea that all persons would be compensated similarly based on their ability to do a job properly, as opposed to seeing this difference in wages and salary. But again, we're factoring in that individuals of different types of identities tend to be more funneled into or attracted to career fields that might be lower paying as well. So it's a really complex picture. And again, the point is that we have to be aware of this because we can't just operate with the assumption that anyone can get any job anytime. We would love for that to be the case, but systemically, there's a lot of things that make that not possible. So COVID really changed a lot when it came to industry. And there are a lot of individuals and scientists who say that it accelerated something that was going to happen anyway. It just happened a lot faster. And so looking broadly, these are occupations that are projected to have the most jobs. Again, this information comes from Bureau of Labor Statistics and from occupational data from US Bureau of Labor Statistics. So looking at projected job changes over the next 10 years, we see that heavily the most need is going to be areas of home health and personal care aides, which are individuals who are not compensated particularly well. And then the next highest is software developers. Again, pulling back in our picture of race ethnicity, these tend to be more male dominated, more white dominated job fields. We see a lot of need when it comes to what we might call blue collar positions. So warehouse stock persons, individuals working in restaurants, laborers, operation managers. We see some need in the healthcare field related to medical and nurses, and then truck drivers. So there's a huge shift in need towards career fields that are not as well compensated. And there's concern that this is drifting in a dangerous direction, which is where you might read things about how the middle class is disappearing. This is why, because if you look at on the right-hand side, the wage differences here, the career fields that are going to be requiring more workers tend to be either on the very high end of things or very low end of things. And so it doesn't leave a lot of space in the middle. And it's going to create a lot of difficulty in the future for individuals to be able to have their basic needs met from their careers. And so this is where we see a new phenomenon of individuals having to do gig work or side hustles to be able to afford to live. And we're drifting into this conversation that tends to come up about what is a livable wage and what does a person have to do in the United States to be able to earn a livable wage. Here's another visual from that same statistical analysis from the Bureau of Labor Statistics for that same time range, showing the other side of the spectrum. So where we're expecting to lose opportunities of industry. So again, a lot of these are going to match up to what we just saw, noting that educational services is going to stay about the same, which is it's a stagnant thing. And here they break down service producing versus goods producing. So we're going to see decreases in things like mining, utilities, retail, wholesale trade, manufacturing jobs. And that's pulling in our discussion from the week. That's related to the idea of more automation when it comes to manufacturing. So where humans used to do these jobs, we're anticipating that more and more machines will be doing these jobs, and then we'll need humans who are able to operate the machines, or humans who are able to code artificial intelligence systems, etc. So you see, projecting over the next 10 years, there's going to be a huge shift when it comes to the economy and when it comes to industry. And that's important to be aware of as career counselors as we're starting to talk to those high school students, middle school students, maybe individuals in college, because by the time that they're getting into the career fields, it might be a very different picture than what we're operating in now. So a note here about age as well, and again, pulling this from that same group of statistics from the Bureau of Labor, we're looking at the share of the workforce by age group projected in the next 10 or so years, and what percentage of the labor force is going to be distributed across different age groups. And so you see we're increasingly staying pretty similar. We're shifting a little bit younger, but we're staying pretty consistent. I mean, moving from 2002 to 2032, and for example, our workforce that's between 45 and 54 years old only changes from 22% to about 20% of the workforce. So it's going to stay pretty similar. And thinking about this, individuals who are being trained now, remembering our previous slide, are going to be expected to work and exist in industries 10 years from now that they weren't adequately trained to work in. And it's going to be a bit of an issue because as the economy changes, as the career view changes in the United States, we need to make sure that we have continuing education, we have workforce training opportunities to help everyone keep up. Because as we look forward, individuals who are 35 to 44 or 25 to 34 now are going to be still in the workforce 10 years from now, maybe operating in a very different capacity and potentially struggling. And thinking about even yourself in this picture, moving into the next 10 years and how much the healthcare fields or education fields might be changing as we introduce things like artificial intelligence, as we evolve systems, as we see the economy shift, we might have to figure out ways to keep up too. So this conversation about shifts in career over the next 10 years, they encompass us too as counselors. And there's a lot of conversations about what is that going to need to look like and how do we keep up and how do we learn these new skill sets that we don't even know exist yet. I mean, as your instructor now in 2024, I would love to be able to teach you those things. And I'm going to have to learn them along with you as your colleague because these are things that just don't exist yet. And we have to figure out ways to keep up. And that's how it's largely going to feel moving into the future. So to wrap up this chapter, I want to talk a little bit about the culturally appropriate career counseling model. This is mentioned in your chapter, and there's some simple steps to approach career conversations in a counseling setting from a culturally responsive space. So first, we, of course, always want to establish that good therapeutic relationship, demonstrate empathy and openness, create safe spaces for conversations about how concerned our client might be about the future of their career fields. We want to identify issues moving from a client-focused space. So what does the client consider to be roles and identities related to their careers and their issues and concerns? We want to assess the impact of culture on their careers. So again, thinking about things that we've talked about in this chapter, like socioeconomic status, like sexuality expression, like gender expression, socioeconomic status. How are those things impacting their experiences in their career setting? We want to set appropriate goals for that client. So if an individual is struggling with some systemic barriers, we don't want to say, well, being a CEO is one of the highest paying positions that I found on Bureau of Labor Statistics websites, so I think you should do that. That might not be attainable for that client in their given situation. Now, if that's something that they want to do, we can certainly connect them with resources and training and supports to try to get there. But we want to make sure that we're considering the whole picture when we're working with clients and goals related to career. And then matching interventions appropriately. So thinking about how values might play into certain types of assessments, considering how based on your nationality or your identities, certain characteristics that come out in assessments might look very different. And so as we're working through interventions, suggestions, assessments, we have to make sure that we're considering those in context of the client's cultural identities as well.